Ladies and gentlemen, the From the Flight Deck podcast presented by Dial-A-Pilot. You got Kyle and Joey here. And Joey, before we dive into things, there is a huge congratulations in order for you. You have some news to share. Do you want to enlighten everybody with what's going on in your life?
Yeah, my girlfriend and I, well, I guess fiance and I now, went to Banff, Alberta, which is in Canada, and it was a total impromptu engagement. We were going for a hike actually, and we saw the sun was coming up. We saw this beautiful like pull off area, like just off the highway. We jumped out of the car. I grabbed the tripod that I'm looking at right now, actually. I had the ring in my pocket and we went out there. All there was were a couple mountain goats or rams or whatever the heck they were. They were watching us, but it was just us two. Pop the question, and then boom, engaged. So huge step. You obviously had a marriage this year, and yeah, it's trying to follow in your footsteps. But it's really exciting. The ring was burning a hole in my pocket. I was ready to get it done, and it happened. So again, uh, huge shout out to my fiance Danny, who's upstairs working right now. But we're very excited.
Oh, dude, that's awesome. It was so funny talking to you about it. It's just amazing that you guys got engaged. I know Danny's a very special person, so I'm so excited for you. Very excited to head out to that wedding. I'm sure it's going to be a fantastic time. But I remember talking to you like 2 weeks ago, and you were like, "Yeah, man, I might get engaged this weekend." And I was like, "What do you mean might get engaged this weekend?" And you're like, "Oh no, it's got to feel right." And I love that that's the way you did it. Because I feel like so often nowadays it's like, oh, you got to get the right photo and you got to do this and you got to do that, and everything's kind of set up and pre-planned, and it just makes it so special the way that you and Danny did it, and a very intimate, private moment between the two of you out there in beautiful Banff. So it was just wonderful to see that. I was so excited to get that text message from you a couple days ago saying that you guys were engaged. So Maddie, my wife, very excited for you guys too. So congratulations once again. I'm sure it's going to be a phenomenal wedding. Just a lot of great people going to be there in attendance and celebrating the two of you.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. You had some big news too, though.
I did, not nearly as big as that. Just some work update stuff. The I finished all my training on the 777, which is nice. So that was amazing. I got to fly all over the place. I had this amazing check airman, which is a specially qualified captain, and he was just again a consummate professional. Really could understand kind of where I was at, and met me where I was at. And we just really enjoyed our trip. We went out to Maui actually, and hung out at the beach for a while. And then let's see, where else did we go? We went to Denver, we went to Houston, we bounced all over the place. We did 3 legs one day on the 777, which for any aviation folks listening, they know that's crazy, because that 777 is an international wide body airplane. You normally do 1 leg that takes 10, 12 hours. But my airline is flying them quite a bit now in the domestic system, which is honestly kind of cool because they're just such comfortable
Hmm.
airplanes. They're big, they're quiet, they're roomy. We can fit 364 people on them, which is a pretty significant number of people. So yeah, we had a great trip. I was really excited to finish up, to have a great check airman through that whole thing, and then finally, I'm now in the middle of 12 days off, so I just get to be home with the wife, once again, Maddie, and we just get to hang out. And so we're kind of fixing our place up. We're building a home gym downstairs, which is really fun,
Wow.
and just hanging out. Yeah, so we went over to some friends last night, watched the 49ers game. I'm a San Francisco 49ers fan, so um, it's just really nice to be home. 45 days of training is a long time, and as I have talked about previously on this show, I was so impressed with the training, and I learned so much from it. And that's actually where the whiteboard idea came from, Joey, and why I started drawing stuff up. And somebody in our Instagram comments was like, "This guy's drawing up plays like he's a high school football coach, and he's talking about my worst nightmare." I thought that was kind of funny. So
That is funny.
training was fantastic, but to be home and just hang out with Maddie and our dog Winnie and our friends has been a very welcome kind of slowdown. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's been nice,
How was the
man.
first
It's
landing?
nice. Money, come on. It was that airplane. That airplane just lands itself essentially. So it's so smooth. My check airman again did a great job, and um, Yeah, it's just such an awesome airplane. The thing flies so unbelievably smooth that it's just really a fingertip flyer, which is crazy. The thing has a maximum takeoff weight of 775,000 pounds. It's a massive airplane, and it just flies like nothing else I've ever flown before. It was so smooth. It literally feels like a small airplane. That's how harmonized the controls are and how well those Boeing engineers did. So I'm just blown away with the airplane. I could see myself making camp on this thing for a long time.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because that's exactly how I felt with both the 74-4 and Dash 8. They both feel like lighter than a Cessna to a certain degree. That fly-by-wire is incredible. I mean, similar takeoff weights on the 400 to the 777-3, but the Dash 8, I mean,
Yeah, start at 925,000 and then
cool.
Yeah.
All right, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, so we would take off 925,000 pounds, and you could literally fly it with. It felt like you could fly it with your thumb and your index finger, and just kind of really, really light on the controls. And then I came to the 757 and the 767-300. But the 757, as you remember, Kyle, feels like you're kind of wrestling the airplane off the ground just because of the way the flight controls work. So the difference in aircraft and the heavier aircraft that you fly, because they're newer, usually the fly-by-wire, it just makes them feel extremely light. But obviously the 757 is a lot of people's favorite airplane to fly. So even with that, it's still great. But very funny that you said the 777 feels the way it does, because I had the exact same experience with the 74.
Yeah, I mean that 74 is just such an amazing airplane. And for the folks that don't know the airplane types off the top of their heads yet, the 747 is a 4-engine airplane with 2 decks, and it was Boeing's flagship product for years and years and years, and they just discontinued it recently just because of economic trends, and now we can fly so far on just 2 engines with extreme reliability. So this 47 just became a little bit outdated, if you will, but that the most recent rendition of it, the 747-8, is what Joey used to fly before going to his current airline, and it's just a beautiful airplane. Pilots love that thing and just respect it for all it's worth. So I still think it's so cool that you got to fly that airplane, Joey. But yeah, man, moving on. So I think today in this episode, we're going to kind of jump back into that Q&A session. We find that a lot of the folks that are engaging with us on social media have a lot of kind of similar questions. They may be worded differently, but the idea is kind of similar. So we're going to start with our friend Barb. Barb is she's one of our Instagram folks, and she's always sending us messages and commenting on stuff. And so first of all, I just very much appreciate her and the guidance that she gives us on what she wants to hear. So she asked us, we talked about engine failures on my trusty little whiteboard over here and kind of what we do to plan for them. And a lot of folks said, hey, well, what if there's a dual engine failure? And that question, because the statistics and the likelihood of it are so unbelievably slim, it's kind of something I don't really talk about too much because it's just almost impossible. But Barb brought up a great point, and she said, hey, well, what happened on Sully's flight? And that was U.S. Airways flight 1549, I think was the flight number. And they lost both engines, taken off out of LaGuardia at about 4,000 feet. They hit a flock of Canadian geese, and that shut both engines down, or it greatly reduced the thrust in both engines. So she said, what happened there? Why couldn't they turn back to LaGuardia? So without going into NTSB, which is National Transportation Safety Board, they're the people who investigate all this stuff. Without going into that level of detail, Joey, let's talk about how these engines are designed. How did those engines shut down and not produce enough power for them to be able to come back to LaGuardia or Teterboro or one of those other airports out there, and how there was still a safe outcome of the flight? And, that crew, Jeff Skiles was the first officer's name. Of course, Sully Sullenberger, the captain. And I should have researched this on who the flight attendants were, because I'm remiss to not mention their names, but those amazing flight attendants that were able to get everybody safely out of the airplane. How did that all come together, Joey? Do you have some ideas you want to share on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a movie with Tom Hanks that does a good job portraying what happened, and then the NTSB investigation afterwards, and they were called to testify on it. But the air traffic control audio Everything that they did in the airplane, it felt pretty good. I mean, obviously there were some things that were different, but what it kind of brings up, and like you said, we're not going to get into the nitty gritty on the NTSB stuff because pilots don't like the backseat, or what do you call it? Like backseat drive, if you will, or
Yeah, Monday morning
Monday morning
quarterback.
quarterback.
Yeah.
Exactly. We don't like to do that. So obviously, what they did, it led to a successful outcome. But the couple things that I heard in the movie and the air traffic control stuff were, one, air traffic control said, okay, well, you can turn back to LaGuardia. I believe that's where they took off. He's like, no, we're not going to make it. And that made me think of something that goes back to initial training, flying Cessnas around and single engine aircraft. Is usually when you lose an engine, well, first of all, you were usually taking off in the runway that had a headwind, is usually how it goes. So first of all, if you turn back around, you're not going to be landing with a tailwind, which in an emergency, obviously you can do. But we're usually taught not to turn back. Obviously, if you have ample altitude, you can turn back. But as you turn an aircraft, you increase the load factor, which increases the stall speed. And stall is not a good thing at a low altitude. So usually we're trying to mitigate that risk by not having to turn very much at a low altitude, especially with no um, no engine source or no source of power. So the fact that he said, yeah, we're not going to be able to make it back, made sense. And then all the other airports, if you fly out of New York, it also made sense. I don't know the exact altitude that they lost engines, but it doesn't really matter. Point being is that was the first thing I thought of, was usually when people try to turn back with no power source at low altitude, it usually doesn't end super well. So that was one of the first things that I thought. This is random, but uh, as soon as it happened, Sully in the movie, and I haven't read the actual transcripts of what he said in the airplane, but I assume it's the same. But he said start the APU to his first officer, which I thought was pretty smart. There's a lot of redundancies as far as electrics go on the aircraft, but the engines are the two um, biggest proponents of electricity, obviously, on the aircraft. And when you lose both, you have a backup system, but that only can last so long. So starting the APU, the auxiliary power unit, which is a third engine, if you will, it doesn't produce any thrust for the aircraft, but it does produce pneumatics, which is air conditioning, and then electrical power for when the engines are off. This is what you usually hear at the gate, buzzing. Sometimes it'll be quiet when you get on the airplane, then they'll start it and it'll get a little louder. Usually what you're hearing is the APU. So the fact that he had the wherewithal with everything going on to say start the APU, which would have been one of the quick reference handbook items, was pretty cool to me as well. But he obviously found a spot that he liked, and he told air traffic control how it was going to go, where he was going to go. Air traffic control was a little taken aback, if I remember correctly, when he said where he was going to land. But it was just cool to see something happen. We don't really train for this. On my aircraft, we have a memory item that we have to do. Like if you have a dual engine failure, we have a memory set of things that we do. So I think what's important here, and you can talk more about the Sully thing, but what's important to know here for the nervous flyers is the airplane can fly with no engines. It's essentially a glider, which the Air Force out in Colorado Springs, that's what they start training on, is gliders. They don't ever even get into a power plant engine until they've gotten signed off flying gliders. And there's been cases, very rare, where at altitude, in the 30,000s of feet, an aircraft has lost both engines. One that comes to mind is the Gimli glider, where they lost both engines. They floated, if you will, or sailed hundreds of miles. I don't remember the exact amount of miles, and they found what looked like an airstrip to them from the air, but it was used to be an airport, but it was just a drag strip, and they landed on that with no problems. Obviously, an exciting situation for the pilots, but just know that the airplanes can fly without both engines, because I get that question every once in a while, is can they fly with no engines? The answer is yes. The higher up, the more options you have. But even down low, like we saw with Sully, you're usually able to come up with a safe outcome if your pilots are on it. And again, it's happened before, but it's extremely rare that it happens.
Yeah, good point on all that. And to add a little bit of context, so Joey mentioned a couple things, load factor being one of them. And what that means is essentially what we would call G'ing up the airplane. And what that would feel like is you kind of get heavy in your seat. And so when you're getting heavy in your seat, that's called increasing the load factor on the airplane. You feel it throughout a flight, very regularly. It's a normal thing, especially during takeoff. You'll notice it. But you'll also feel it in your car. It's just in a different axis. So if you are sitting at a stoplight and you accelerate hard and that pushes you back into the seat, that is a load factor. It's just on a horizontal axis instead of a vertical axis. So there's some aerodynamic principles that come into play when we talk about increasing the load factor, which then increases, as Joey said, the stall speed, which is when the wing stops producing lift. Now, of course, as you can definitely gather, you don't want to stop producing lift at any point. And so as pilots, we're trained to stay far away from what that stall speed. And so we, in the event of a dual engine failure, push the nose over in order to maintain flying speed and allow that airplane to glide, as Joey said. So, what we would do in a situation like that is the airplane still has the systems to actually be controllable. As Joey said, we'd start the APU, the auxiliary power unit. That gives us hydraulic pressure. It gives us electrical power. We actually have what's called a ram air turbine that would automatically deploy. And that's this little propeller that's probably, I don't know the exact size. It's probably 24 inches in diameter. And it spins at some insane RPM, like 30,000 RPM. And that'll actually also provide a hydraulic and electrical power to the airplane in the event of a dual engine failure. On the 777, it's actually the loss of power to both main AC, alternating current, transfer buses that would allow that to happen. So there's a little systems knowledge because, training was recent, but that's actually what it would be. It's not necessarily a dual engine failure. It's a dual electrical failure. So all that being said, we're getting a little, heady into all this stuff, but the reason that at the very beginning of this whole thing, I mentioned, hey, these dual engine failures, they are the statistics of them happening are so minuscule. Well, in this situation, we talked about Cactus 1549, which is the call sign for that flight, ingesting birds into both engines. And the engines are actually designed, and they go through testing for this. And you can find YouTube videos of this. When they ingest a large bird like that, a Canadian goose, they're actually designed to go into what's called an auto shutdown. And that's to protect the engine from essentially throwing parts out of it. And so that's a self-protection mechanism. And then that way the airplane can fly on the other engine, no problem. So it's actually designed that way because it's safer. Now they'll still produce, as much thrust as they possibly can essentially, but it will go into an auto shutdown type mode in order to protect itself. So that is such a rare event. That was in 2009. I haven't heard of anything similar since then, and really haven't heard of anything prior to that. That was in the United States. That Gimli glider that you talked about. I want to point out that was a fuel starvation issue. They just ran out of gas because they didn't take off with enough. Now, when incidents like that have happened historically, what we talk about a lot on our calls, Joey, is that we as an industry learn so much from that and change the policies and procedures on how everything happens. And so now, like at my airline, we have, I don't even know how many eyes are looking at how much fuel is actually on board the airplane when we take off. And one of our last call outs before we push back is it's in the before push checklist, and it's fuel, planned gate, 36.5 on board. And that's referring to the weight in thousands of pounds. So that would be 36,500 pounds of gas on board. We measure fuel by pounds, and we're actually going to talk about this a little bit later in the episode. But the whole reason behind that is 1 pound of jet fuel does the same amount of work, no matter the density, temperature, all that stuff, where 1 gallon of jet fuel does not do the same amount of work. So we just measure it in a more accurate way, which is why that all comes together. It's a little bit weird when you first start flying to start thinking of fuel in pounds versus gallons because you've been doing it your whole life. So anything else you want to add on the dual engine failure stuff, Joey, and how amazing Sully and his crew did on that? Anything you want to finish that thought with?
Yeah, the last thing that I think of is before we go into an airport or out of an airport, we need to find the weather for that airport, and it's put out in an ATIS, which is, Kyle, do you know what ATIS stands for off the top of your head?
Automated Terminal Information System.
He just went through training, you could tell. But anyways, in this ATIS that we get for each large airport produces this. It talks about the weather, the wind, the clouds, all those kind of things. But one of the things in there is it says caution birds in the area. If airplanes or if the people on the ground or air traffic control or anybody sees airplanes in the airport's vicinity, they'll usually put it in the ATIS, which usually alerts us a little bit more to be thinking about it. So I don't know if that was a byproduct necessarily of the Sully crash, but we see it quite often, and it's definitely something that we're alert to. And other aircraft will call out birds as we're flying down to the runway. We'll see them at 400 feet. 800 feet, whatever it is, we'll let air traffic control know so that the aircraft behind us have a heads up that it's coming. So definitely more keyed into that ever since the Sully crash. I mean, we both started our careers after the crash, but or not crash because they survived, but the incident. And so we do see that a lot in the ATIS when we're going into and out of airports.
There's actually also bird mitigation programs that are
Yes.
in effect at airports all over the world too, and so they'll actually use noisemakers and different methods of keeping birds away from the airports because they do pose a threat to aviation safety. Just we just want to keep them away for a number of reasons, and more than anything, it's a safety issue for the bird than it is for the airplane. We impact a bird, it doesn't really bother the airplane. The bird doesn't fare as well, so we of course don't want to do that. I've hit in my career, oh gosh, 10 birds probably, maybe more. Um, I've taken them off the windshield. That one always kind of wakes you up a little bit. You'll be flying, especially at night. Uh, I don't know if this is kind of a dumb statement or not. It very well could be, but I didn't know birds flew around at night. We were up in the clouds. We were at like 4,000 feet coming into New York, and we took a bird off the windshield, and that'll wake you up, no matter the time of the day. So we had that one happen. I hit unfortunately, and I hesitate to even mention this, but we actually hit a bald eagle going into
Ooh.
Vancouver one day. Yeah, that one was I didn't like. Well, I never like a bird strike, but that one was sad. Um,
Oh,
we were
jeez.
landing in Vancouver. We were landing to the east, and so we were over the bay. And at about 500 feet, I saw kind of a flash go below my window. I was the first officer, so I was on the right side of the airplane. I saw a flash go by, and then I felt a thump in the airplane. And airplane flew fine. We monitored the engine instruments. Hey, okay, continue the landing. And so we did. And when we got to the gate, part of the bird was actually stuck in the airplane.
Mm.
And so we got that dealt with, if you will. And the airplane had to stay in Vancouver for like 3 days because they had to do some fixes to it. And of course, it wasn't a safety of flight issue, but we always repair these airplanes to make sure that they are in tip-top condition for every single flight that they do. So my buddy Dylan, Joey, you know Dylan really well. He was also in my wedding. He was actually the pilot that went and picked that airplane up after they had fixed it, which was kind of one of those small world type things. So there was that one. I've taken numerous birds off the wings. Let's see, anything else? Took one off the radome, which is the very nose of the airplane not too long ago. So it's always sad. I don't tell these stories, as a braggadocious, look what happened to me. This is cool. I tell it as the airplane is designed to handle these things. And it's just an unfortunate part of, being out there flying. We are soaring around in their habitat and using the technology that they brought. And unfortunately, those, it's just a part of the game. So, yeah. Any bird strikes from you, Joey?
Yeah, I've had a few similar places, especially the ones that hit around the windows. You're gonna definitely hear anything that hits up, underneath the fuselage near the nose. You're gonna hear it. But a lot of the times, anything that hits the wing or and I also like to mention that not every bird is going to take out an engine too, by the way. Just because there's a bunch of birds flying around and one goes into the engine, it may not take it out. There's a hot section and a cold section of the engine, and if it goes through the cold section, which essentially is just the fan, and then goes essentially back out into the airstream, that's usually not going to take out an engine, especially the small little birds. Now, Canadian geese, those are massive birds. Those are going to do some damage, but aircraft have taken and will take little birds, and it'll be no problem if it gets into the hot section, which is through the core of the engine. I think Kyle's talked about this before, but again, we'll try not to get too techie here. But if it goes through the cold section, which again, it just goes through the fan and out the back, it's usually designed to handle small birds. And they do these tests during the manufacturing process. They We'll have to show you guys a picture sometime, but it's in a big warehouse looking type facility. They spool up the engine to full power and they throw a literal frozen, already dead bird through to simulate and see how it will react to a bird strike. And most of the time, again, if it's smaller, there's no specific number on this because even a little bird through the hot section could be bad news. But with new engines, the hot section is relatively small compared to the cold section. So there's a lot more area for the bird to go through and potentially not harm the engine. But that is tested during the manufacturing phase to make sure that it can handle it and to show what it would do if there was a failure so that it's not throwing parts like Kyle said. So, yeah, my bird strikes have been of the benign variety, if you will. I know to the people listening that sounds like a crazy statement, but even the windshields are designed to handle this. And if a windshield broke, there's 2 panes usually, sometimes 3, depends on the manufacturer. If one pane breaks, well, luckily there's a pilot sitting on the other side. We'll usually, continue flying the aircraft. That's the first thing we do. Hand the aircraft to the other individual, and they'll either land or we'll go fix the problem. But yeah, only a couple bird strikes. I try to avoid them, Kyle.
Yeah, I think avoiding birds is certainly the technique that's preferred by just about everybody. So, Joey, there was also, and I say this one as a, again, being the goal of this podcast to provide insight into how safe aviation is and how over-engineered these airplanes are. There was another sad incident that happened for some wildlife, but at our former airline, I think it was a SkyWest flight, Joey, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we had a deer hit a CRJ on takeoff. Do you remember this?
Ooh, I don't remember this.
Oh, you didn't study this? Okay, maybe. So I got hired after Joey at SkyWest, and so they may have just implemented this in the training program at that point in time. But there was a deer that ran out on the runway and it impacted one of the wings of a CRJ. And
Wow.
they were past the takeoff decision speed. And so they had to take the airplane flying. And we've talked about that's that V1 speed we've talked about multiple times. And so they got the airplane in the air and they were leaking fuel out of that right wing because obviously a deer hitting an airplane is a pretty big deal. So they were leaking fuel out of the right wing. They brought the airplane back around and landed safely at the airport that they had taken off from. So I mean, talk about, go buy a lottery ticket after that one. You got some statistic on, statistical advantage going for what you just experienced. But yeah, so these airplanes are just incredibly robust in what they can handle. And that's the whole idea behind talking about what we're talking about here with bird strikes. And that we would actually call a wildlife strike. Because these wildlife live in the vicinity of airports and they can be out on runways and things like that. So again, every airport has a mitigation plan and they try and keep them off the runways and taxiways and all those things. And they do an incredibly good job. I've never seen wildlife. That's actually not true. I saw a coyote once running across the runway in Portland. But when you see it, you call it out. And so like we were taxiing out, I saw it and I said, "Hey, tower, this is our flight number. We see a coyote running across runway, whatever it is. I can't remember there, 15 right or something." And they said, "Oh, okay." And then they, will advise the pilots that are either approaching the runway or getting ready to take off. And then they look for it and say, "Oh, okay, we see it. It's off the runway now." And they'll continue to land. Or if they don't see it and we advise them, "Hey, it's kind of close to where you guys are touching down," they'll just go around. Again, go around is free. We always, always, always have the option to go around. So, yeah, that's just something I wanted to point out on the wildlife stuff. So that's our thing on bird strikes. Joey, we had another question about PA announcements. You want to talk about that one a little bit?
Yeah, so this one is from Alyssa Wyatt, and it looks like they say a flight I was on from LAX to Houston started having turbulence, and they told the flight attendant to sit down. Then it felt like we were going down, and when I looked at the altitude on the screen, we were going down. I panicked. The pilot asked them to call them for a report. Is that normal? So the last part I think was just a misspelling, but I panicked. Then the pilot asked them to call them for a report. So a couple things to unpack on that one. One is I don't think we addressed this on the last one. I mean, I think we did, but I want to reemphasize. On the last podcast, we talked about turbulence, and we kept saying that turbulence is completely safe for the aircraft. It's completely safe for you. I want to amend that a little bit. It is completely safe for you so long as you adhere to the seatbelt sign. And why I'm bringing that up is usually along with the seatbelt sign. If the turbulence gets bad enough, if you will, we're going to also ask the flight attendants to take their jump seats and take those carts, which can weigh upwards of 90 to 100 pounds, and put them and stow them in a secure place. The reason for this is because if you hit turbulence, moderate to severe, it can make things levitate, if you will, because the aircraft is going through some bumps and it can make things pop up. And you've seen the viral videos out there of this happening. So it's completely normal for the pilots to tell the flight attendants to take their jump seats because most of the on the job injuries that happen, or just the injuries in general in aviation now, are because of turbulence related situations. And so we are very safe and very cautious when it comes to this. And we're going to have the flight attendants sit down, even at turbulence that isn't what we would consider all that bad. Again, just because we don't want somebody to roll an ankle or, especially if we're going to encounter some stronger turbulence, we don't want the carts going anywhere because that is where over the last, however many years, almost all the injuries and or if there have been any deaths have been related to turbulence, not because the aircraft something happened to the aircraft, but mainly because of what's happening inside. So it is completely normal for us to tell the flight attendants to take their jump seats. We'll usually call them, but that flight attendants take your jump seats is usually when the turbulence is imminent and we need them to do it now. Or because we've heard a report out ahead, or we see something on our iPads that's telling us it's coming, or the dispatcher, we want them to get seated now. And so usually this is happening behind the scenes. We'll call them and say, hey, we're expecting turbulence here in, let's call it 20 minutes. If you guys can put everything away, we'll make an announcement to the folks that we're having you all sit because we don't want the carts out, etc. We're going to stop the service, all that jazz that I'm sure you've heard. But if they say flight attendants take their jump seats, that's just because it's a little bit quicker because it takes the flight attendants a while to get the carts back, to go to their individual jump seats and get buckled in. So completely normal, and it's usually out of an abundance of caution. The second part about I panicked when the pilot asked them to call for a report. Usually after we sustain moderate or greater turbulence, if it's a pretty big jolt, we're going to call back to the flight attendants. Usually not over the PA, so I'm not exactly sure what happened here, but maybe they were a first class passenger and heard it. We're going to call back and ask, hey, is everybody okay? Because again, most on job injuries in aviation happen to the flight attendants, unfortunately, because of turbulence. So we're going to call and make sure everything is okay. That's what I'm guessing happened in this, and that also is normal. So again, all of this is normal, but I just wanted to modify what we said last week. Again, it's always safe for the aircraft. The aircraft has been manufactured to handle it, but it potentially isn't safe for you in the back if you're not adhering to the seatbelt sign, and it's definitely not safe for the flight attendants if we don't tell them to take their jump seats when we see turbulence coming. So if everything works as it should, all of the turbulence is completely safe. If the passengers are watching the sign, if the flight attendants are listening to the pilots, and if the pilots are doing their jobs and looking ahead, it's going to be completely safe. But that's the only thing I wanted to add. But it is a very good question. What else do you want to talk about with that one, Kyle?
Yeah, this is actually a really good point because each airline has different procedures, and so I know exactly what she's talking about because my airline
Okay.
does this,
Oh,
and I guess yours doesn't. So point to mine again. It's crazy. So we actually, uh, and there's a number of reasons that we do this, but when we were looking at the statistics, it said that the on-the-job injuries for flight attendants were happening during turbulence, and specifically happening during the descent for flight attendants. So we moved quickly and made these different procedures that get everybody on the same page. Instead of playing telephone where we're calling the lead flight attendant, then the lead flight attendant is telling everybody else, we make a PA announcement: flight attendants, take your jump seats. And they
yeah.
know that means they have to be in their jump seats within 5 minutes. We can give a qualifier: flight attendants be in your jump seats in 2 minutes or less. And then we also have another one: flight attendants be seated immediately. And that would be, an unexpected turbulence. That I've personally never used that one, but I want to point it out that we do have that. And then we say flight attendants check in. And that means all the flight attendants call the lead flight attendant. They say, hey, we're all good in the back, we're all good in the middle, we're all good in the front. And it's just a clarification that everybody was sitting down, nothing spilled, none of the passengers had any injuries, anything like that. And then the lead flight attendant calls the flight deck and they say, hey, we're all good in the back. And we say, okay, great. You guys are free to get up, or hey, stay in your jump seats for another 5 minutes or so. And then we just have a conversation with them. And then again, from there, we normally will let the flight attendants resume their services before we turn that main seatbelt sign back off. So that's kind of the cadence that things go, is flight attendants are released to do their thing first. And then we always take a little bit more caution with the passengers. The flight attendants, they're used to this, right? They're walking around on those airplanes all day long. They're used to the airplane shifting underneath them. You may have somebody on our airplane as a passenger that hasn't flown in 5 years, 10 years, maybe even their whole lives. And so for them, it's a little bit more dangerous just because they don't have the kind of muscle memory and the footing. And so that's always the route that, I like to explain things, is everything we do. And we did talk about this last week in aviation, is out of an abundance of caution. And so we make those announcements and we try and get everybody on the same page. And then, in addition, 40% of the traveling public is afraid of flying. That means 60% is not. And some of those folks, they don't listen to that seatbelt sign at all. And so you have to make these announcements that can sound a little bit frightening to get people like, hey, this is serious. You need to be in your seat. And so, from the nervous flyer standpoint, I always like to point out, hey, this is what we're doing and this is the idea behind it. But you can hear people, whether it's the captain, the first officer, the flight attendants, whoever, being very stern over the PA. Those are for the folks that maybe have an issue with listening to others or authority figures or anything like that. Not to say that pilots really are an authority figure, but I just like to point that out. So that's one thing. And then Joey, the question goes on to say, we started going down, and going down is a scary phrase. What does that mean? That means descending the airplane. And so what we'll do in turbulence, we talked about this on the last episode, I won't get too far into it, but if we encounter turbulence, we're going to change our altitude because I wouldn't say 9 times out of 10, maybe 7 times out of 10, that'll get us into a smoother ride. And so we'll either climb or descend. And so that would be why I think her name was Alyssa, would have recognized that the airplane had started descending. She probably heard the engine spool back a little bit. She heard all those announcements. So that's the reason that we do that. So great question there. Anything else there, Joey? Are you ready to move on to the next one?
I will say we have the same calls at my airline. I was just trying to be more generalized for every airline, that because I don't know what everybody does. We also have the flight attendants take your jump seats immediately, or all the other things that you said. I don't believe, and maybe we do, and I just missed it, have a like automatic report. That's usually once everybody's seated, again, because we don't want to put the fear of God into everybody. We'll usually call the flight attendants after something like this happens, but we do absolutely have the flight attendants take your jump seats immediately, or a time frame as well. I was just trying to be generic for everyone. The next
Gotcha. You
one
got a little jealous
is
about our procedures, huh? You just had to make something up. No,
a
all kidding
little bit.
aside, all kidding aside, the airlines do a really good job of sharing safety information. We occasionally talk about this. I try to stay away from this, just because of the interest in what we're doing as far as trying to help folks. But we do occasionally mention, the airline is a business, blah, blah, blah. We're very competitive in the markets that we serve and all those things, but we are not competitive when it comes to safety. Whenever an airline finds that something is working really well for them, we share that information immediately. And we have a really good working relationship from our flight ops training, our flight ops standardization, with Joey's airline, that again, we don't mention, which airline we specifically fly for, but all of the airlines share information and ensure that there's a high level of safety going on, because that's the most important thing. Business is business, but safety is safety, and safety is always the top priority. So it's really important to point that out. And one of the things I also want to add on that before we go into the next one, which is a question I'm excited to get into, Joey. But one of the things that I wanted to mention is that when we're at training, which I just came out of once again, is that they are so adamant that we do not make decisions based on how much fuel it's going to burn, as far as when safety comes into question. So, when we talk about go around burns a lot of gas, but it's not a, oh, don't go around because it's unsafe. Or I'm sorry, don't go around because it burns gas. It's go around every time. If you think that there's a need for a go around, go around. It's free. Come back around, try it again. That's what we always say. Go around, it's free. And of course, it's not actually free. It costs money, but that's not what's important. And so the pilots are trained, and it is beat into our minds that we do not make safety decisions based on financial impact to the companies. So I'm very proud of that. I think that's a great thing. And, it's something that I just want to point out. And that's something that is always at the front of my mind is when we get on the ground and we look back and we do a debrief, which is what we do at the end of every flight. I want to go back and say that I have a great reason that I can stand behind for every decision I made in the airplane that day. And if I don't, I sit there and I talk about it and I say, you know what? I made a decision that I don't stand behind now, and I'm learning from it and I'm moving forward, and I will not make that decision again. And if that situation arises, I will make a different decision. And I promise on this day that that is what I stand for and that is what I will do. I have a very specific memory of one, again, from my SkyWest days where we were coming into San Francisco. They had slowed us down and we got kind of compacted and tight. And as we were trying to get the airplane to descend, we had the speed brakes out. And on this airplane, and just for everyone's reference, the speed brakes are on the top of the wing. It's a board that comes up and kind of disturbs the airflow and helps us slow down and helps us reduce our lift, which in turn lets us descend the airplane a little bit faster. So on the airplane I was flying, you couldn't extend the flaps past a certain point with the speed brakes extended. And so you would leave it at flaps 2 with the speed brakes out and try and get down to the profile, the descent profile that you wanted to be on, and then you would configure the rest of the way. Well, that sets you up for an unstabilized approach, and that bit me that day. And so at about 1,000 feet, the gear was down, the flaps were still at 2, we were on profile, and we had 3 flap settings left to go. And I called for the next flap setting, and the captain said, "Hey, this is not cool." I said, I know, it was unintentional. And we configured the airplane and landed, and we got to the gate. And before he could say anything, I was like, let me start here. That was a critical mistake that I made. And I do not stand by it. I should have gone around. Moving forward, when I upgrade to captain, I need to know that I have the ability and the mindset that is not get the job done. I have the mindset that is do the job in the safest possible way and be able to stand behind every decision. And that was my moment of realizing that I had a little bit of a get the job done mentality. And so that was a kind of a turning point in my aviation career. And I'm really proud to say that because I genuinely feel that way. And I've talked about that point in airline interviews. And, in some of the folks that Joey and I have the fantastic opportunity to mentor that are coming up in the aviation ranks kind of behind us. I always point that story out and I say that was a huge mistake that I made. And I'm excited that I learned from it. So a little bit of an aside there, Joey, but I wanted to point that out.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. And I think pilots are very self-critical, and that is just instilled in us in this industry. We're supposed to be self-critical. We're supposed to debrief ourselves because that's how we learn. And I think that's admirable. But we all try to do it to differing degrees. Some people are good at it. Some people don't like to be self-critical. But we try to learn from each and every flight. Did you have the next question?
Yeah, I got it. So the question was along the lines of how can an airplane essentially fly for 15 hours? I feel like that starts to cut it close
Yeah, I
as far
got it.
as, the
I got it.
maximum. Okay, yeah, hit it.
Sure. So it's from I don't know how to say this. La Rara Shell. Sorry if I butchered that name. Are 16-hour
Beautiful.
flights safe or is it cutting it close with the maximum amount of time an airplane can fly? How many hours of fuel can these planes hold? Kyle, you start since you're on an aircraft that does an incredible job at flying a long ways.
Yeah, we got those big fuel tanks, and we also, and this is important, have big lavatory tanks. because
Yeah,
believe it or
seriously.
not, that is actually a limiting factor for some of these airplanes. Like we used to fly the 767 from Paris to San Francisco, and that would get really tight on lav space. So you need to make sure that you have the tanks because we can't. There's a rumor going around, and I actually posted a story today on our Dial a Pilot Instagram. There's a rumor that we can dump the lavatories in flight, and that's not something that I've ever heard of. Joey, have you heard of that?
No, but that brings up, do you remember that regulation, Part 91, where as long as you make sure that it's not going to hit anyone or anything, you can throw human specimen out the
Oh.
aircraft? Do you remember that? Do you remember
No.
that rule?
Are
You
you
don't?
making
I'll
that
pull it
up?
up.
That sounds
No,
pretty made up.
I promise you that's a thing. Well, I'll find it while you're
Oh,
talking.
dude, that's funny. Okay, yeah,
Because
yeah.
I mean, think
I
about it.
did
In a
not know
Cessna,
that.
what are you supposed to do? In a Cessna, what are you supposed to do? Like, so I will pull that
Yeah,
up for
I
you.
mean, land? I don't know. Anyways,
I'll find it.
that's a
I'll find
whole
it.
aside, but something that the engineers think about. So I wanted to point it out. Now, on the fuel. So this is, I think, really the crux of the question is how much gas can these things carry? And is 16 hours getting to that restrictive, point where they don't have enough gas to get there? And the answer lies really in what we call dispatch methods. Now, we've talked about our dispatchers on the show before, and they're these fantastic people, incredibly smart, just passionate about aviation. I've had the fantastic opportunity to have a few of them on our jump seat, and we get to ask them a bunch of questions and really figure out how to work better as a team. And so what they do is they actually go in and plan all of these flights, and so they have these different software programs. It's probably the same for most airlines, but there's I would also assume that there's a few different programs that you can use. And anyways, they have very specific numbers on each airplane. Hey, what is the fuel flow factor that we need to add to this airplane based off of how it's configured, the drag that this specific tail number has? So like that airplane that day, those conditions, they know exactly how much more fuel percentage wise it's going to burn over what the book says it's going to, what the engineers have come up with it or what the engineers have come up with. So they calculate, hey, if we're going from Joey, I think before we started recording, it was Newark to Manila. That's the longest flight. Is that right?
I can pull that up too. I'm researching a few things. I feel like Jamie from Joe Rogan podcast.
Yeah, there you go.
If you know
Okay,
what
so
that
I
is.
think it was Newark to Manila, but here's one that I know a little bit more about: San Francisco to Hong Kong. So that's about a 15 and a half hour flight, 16-hour flight, something along those lines. And so what they'll do is they'll actually pull up the exact fuel burn that's going to take. And I'm going to make up a number. Let's say it's 300,000 pounds of gas. Again, we do all of our fuel calculations in pounds. So we'll know exactly how much it's going to burn, but we don't carry how much it's going to burn, of course, because we need contingency plans. So there's different procedures that you can use, and there's different what we call operation specifications that the FAA has designed and then different airlines can apply for. And they have to show, hey, we know exactly how to do this. This is our plan. This is our platform that we use to make sure that we can meet the criteria associated with this. Because what they were doing, I think the way that the FAR is written was that you had to carry 10% more than what it's going to take for you to carry fuel all the way over there. So if you have to carry 300,000 pounds on your flight, you have to carry a reserve of 30,000 pounds. Well, those numbers get pretty large. And for us to carry that much gas, well, something has to give. And so we can't take as many people. We can't take as much cargo because, of course, the airplane can only carry so much weight. On my airplane, the maximum takeoff weight we have is 775,000 pounds. It's massive. But when 330,000 pounds of that is gas, there's only so much left because the airplane, of course, weighs a ton itself. So, the idea is maximize the amount of people and cargo you can take. So it was the 10% rule. Well, then they said, okay, you can actually go down to 5% if you have these different operation specifications that you can meet. Or you can do this other thing, and that is essentially monitoring how much fuel every single one of your flights takes that goes on that exact route. And then you take that, and I think the number is you have to have 2 months worth of data at a minimum, and you have to carry what we would call, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, so let me back up a little bit. You have to land with at least 45 minutes. That's 45 minutes of gas. That's the FAR minimum, Federal Aviation Regulation minimum. And then for my airline, we actually have to land with a minimum of 1 hour of gas. That's an airline thing. Is yours the same, Joey? 1 hour gas?
We have we won't get into all the rules, but we have a little bit different rules.
Okay. Okay. So ours is 1 hour. And then so the whole idea behind those is we carry the amount of gas that makes sense for us to carry, and it's always plenty. It's always plenty. And then if the pilots don't like how much fuel we have, flight plan, we can add more. And they'd never hesitate and say, well, are you sure we're not going to be able to take that cargo we really want to take? That's never a question. They say, yep, you guys want an extra 5,000 pounds? No problem at all. So that's kind of the idea behind how the fuel planning works. So anything else to add on that, Joey?
Yeah, just to summarize, to make it concise here, but very well thought out. I mean, that you had a lot of good stuff in there. But just to summarize, we always have enough fuel, to get from where we are to where we're going, plus a little bit. It depends if it's domestic flight. And then if it's an international flight, if you're going to need an alternate airport in case the weather is bad. But we always have the fuel, and it's usually built even more conservative than what we actually do, and that is a whole different topic. But we always have the fuel for the flight, and then we have some extra. So, and that doesn't matter if you're flying from Minneapolis to Fargo, North Dakota, which is like a 40-minute flight, or whether you're doing these really long flights, which brings me to the question that you had asked that I didn't remember. The longest flight is New York to Singapore, 18 hours and 50 minutes. And on that flight, they're also going to have that extra fuel that Kyle was talking about. So it really doesn't matter how short or how long the flight is. There's rules as to how much fuel we need. So it will never be a question of, oh, we're pushing it or it's close. Now, there are some airlines who want to go even further, and they'll usually have a planned fuel stop somewhere along the way. So like a London or Gatwick or Amsterdam, these cities that are on the western edge of Europe, a lot of the times will be places where aircraft will stop, do a planned fuel stop, so everybody stays in their seats, they fuel up, and then they continue on to the U.S. So it is very common to see those, especially with international carriers. But yeah, longest flight is 18 hours and 50 minutes. And for the bathroom thing, FAR Part 91.15, which is, these are the rules of the FAA, dropping objects. No pilot in command of a civil aircraft may allow any object to be dropped from the aircraft in that flight that creates a hazard to persons or property. However, this section does not prohibit the dropping of any objects if reasonable precautions are taken to avoid injury or damage to persons or property. So I think the way that this was thought out by people that fly GA is if you're doing a really long flight, you potentially could drop, if you had to go to the bathroom, drop things out of the aircraft so long as you do this. Now, have I ever done that? No. Would I ever do that? No. But it does look like there's some leeway for dropping objects, whatever those objects may be.
What's funny is where my mind goes with this is kind of a point proven type mentality of like the FAA thinks of everything. And so they make a regulation about, dropping stuff out of the airplane. So, it just goes to show that there's so many minds that go into making aviation as safe as it is and ensuring that we have a high level of integrity and moving forward. So, I think, one of the other things I wanted to throw out there, the amount of fuel that we carry, pounds is kind of a hard thing to understand because it's just not an easy one to kind of comprehend. But the airplane that I'm flying now carries 47,890 gallons of gas. That's a lot of gas. Now, to put that into perspective, a Toyota Camry carries 13.2 gallons of gas. So we have 3,628 Toyota Camry fuel tanks in the 777, and which is significant. And one of the other things that I think is interesting as far as the weight of the fuel goes, we can actually take two Boeing 737s, which are, the domestic workhorse for many, many, many airlines. We can take two of them, stack them on top of each other as far as a weight thing goes, and then put them in our fuel tanks. That's how massive these fuel tanks are. So, of course, that's not a dimension thing. That's just a pure weight thing. But that's how much weight those things carry. And then, Joey, the airplane that you used to fly, we looked this up before too, 64,225 gallons of gas. That's a lot of gas. These things can
That's a
go pretty
very
long ways before they start running into fuel issues.
hmm cool. Well, I think we have what I'm learning here is we have a lot of good questions to go, but we're obviously running up on our time. So I think we're gonna have to do a part two of this, and it's also showing me that we are gonna have to have something in front of us and do a fuel pod as well. So we'll get those out to you guys in the future. But there are a lot of good questions. Again, continue to add questions to all the different socials that Dial-A-Pilot has, because we really do enjoy these ones because we like doing podcasts on things that you all are curious about. So please post questions, no matter how silly you think they may be. We don't judge. We understand that this is a very complex industry, and as you can see, we even mess up some of the minutia as well. So please ask questions. We're going to do our best to answer them on a. I guess that would be a part three Q&A pod. But yeah, nothing else to add. I love doing this, and like, follow, share, and Kyle will send us home.
Yeah, that's it, man. You hit the nail on the head. The like, follow, share really helps us out. We certainly enjoy it. It's been amazing. Just getting to know folks over the last 6 months since this whole thing started. So when I say that Joey and I are grateful for the opportunity to kind of share and help folks out in their journey to kind of overcoming that fear of flying, I really mean it. We both love doing it. It's really fun. It's fun to interact with everybody and hear everybody's stories. So yeah, I guess that's all I have to say for now. And until next week, we'll be back with another one. Keep those questions coming. We love the suggestions. And I hope everybody has a very happy holiday with their family or whatever you may be up to. So once again, from the Dial-A-Pilot team, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. Joey, congrats on the engagement. I'm so happy for you. And we'll talk to
Thank
you
you.
next time.